A new era in Georgia. The president concedes defeat in parliamentary elections and says the opposition can now form the next government. What does that mean for this former Soviet republic? And why does Georgia matter? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Hazem Seeker. Welcome to the program. A year ago, hardly anyone knew what he looked like. Now, billionaire businessman Bidzina Ivanishvili is the next Prime Minister of Georgia. On Tuesday, President Saakashvili conceded he'd lost the closely fought parliamentary vote. Ivanishvili and his party, Georgian Dream, are now expected to form the new government. Saakashvili will remain in office until presidential elections a year from now. But under a new law adopted in 2010, most of the president's powers will be transferred to the prime minister after Saakashvili's term ends in 2013.
There have been many violations. Over the past year, there was strong pressure on our team and on me personally. There have been many crimes, but I think, first of all, our people have shown their political culture and an ability to organise themselves, which, along with our coalition work, created a good precedent. What's more important is that we will continue our joint work in the future. And I would like to repeat once again that we will do everything possible for fruitful cooperation with the current government and our future opposition.
So let's take a closer look at Georgia's new Prime Minister. Well, Bidzina Ivanishvili is a billionaire who heads the Georgian Dream Coalition. Until last year, he avoided public appearances, but then announced he was entering politics. He has promised to stay in the job for only 2 years. After that, he says he'll step aside to allow professional politicians to take over. Some of his opponents accuse him of being a Russian stooge. So is Saakashvili's era coming to an end in Georgia? Well, to help us discuss this and a whole lot of other things further, we're joined by our guests from Tbilisi, Eka Gigauri, Executive Director of Transparency International Georgia. From Moscow, we have Sergei Strokhan, political analyst, columnist and host of the program Red Line, a current affairs show in Russia. And from London, James Nixie, research fellow at Chatham House and an analyst on the Caucasus region. Good to have you all with us. Eka Gigauri, if I could start with you first. Now, we'll talk about what this result represents politically in just a moment, but I want to ask you, first of all, about how this election was conducted. Are you satisfied that it was conducted freely and fairly, first of all?
First of all, good evening. So I'm glad that I have the opportunity to share my thoughts with you. I think that we should divide the elections in two parts. So the first part is the pre-election environment, and the second part is the election day. So for the pre-election environment, I would say that we had very complicated situation here when the line between the government and the ruling party did not exist, and so we had the situation when the government was fighting with their main opponents, so the opposition coalition called Georgian Dream. And we saw lots of violations from the side of the government, but the main violation was that there was the selective application of the law and regulations, and so we saw plenty of cases when the huge fines or some administrative restrictions were introduced towards the opposition and not towards the ruling party, which was the main problem, I would say. As for the election day, we actually were monitoring the whole elections. We had 300 monitors over the whole territory of Georgia, and we got lots of information about the small violations, but we also witnessed the big violations, especially in the regions. For instance, yesterday, after the election process was finished, the special forces of Georgian Ministry of Interior went to several precinct stations, and they asked the observers to leave the station, and then they rewrote some people from the election commission stayed there, and they rewrote the all the documentation. So, and according to this new documentation, the ruling party was winning. So. Also, we had one case actually when the election commission was counting the votes, and then somebody, the representative from election commission, came and put some failed or put some ballot papers on the top. So this was the fake ballot papers, and this was also the violation. Also, we had the cases.
All right, but despite sorry to interrupt,
yeah.
but despite some of these violations that you talk about, were they to a degree that they, in your view, have affected the final result of these elections? Because by all accounts, the winning party has declared victory, and Mr. Saakashvili's ruling party has accepted defeat. So, in that sense, has it made a difference to the overall outcome?
So I would say that in general, of course, there is no exact formula which can be used in this kind of situations. I would say that in some ways, of course, it from one way it affected the general results, but from the other way, when I talked about the selective application of the law, I think that in some ways it had the opposite effect, because people in Georgia thought that this unfair treatment of the opposition was not good, and some people really supported the opposition also because of that. So I would say that at the end of the day, I would say that still the Georgian population had the possibility to express their opinion during these elections. Yes, there were the violations, but the main thing is now for Central Election Commission to count the votes, because we don't have the final results at this point, and we expect from the Central Election Commission to count the votes and not to violate the law, because still we have we might have the expectation that something is going on there, and not everything will go properly.
Let's get the view from Moscow on these results in a former Soviet republic. Bidzina Ivanishvili has been variously portrayed by his opponents as a Russian stooge. What does this election result mean in Moscow?
Well, let me start by saying that Georgian election is a good chance for us to compare it with our own parliamentary elections, which took place last December. And probably you're aware that those polls were associated with the common understanding that there was a mass fraud during Russian parliamentary elections. And while United Russia ruling party officially got 49%, independent polls say that it should have been much less, around 30, 35 something. So as I understand, despite all those violations my Georgian colleague was referring to, so far there's no any clear evidence that we have got some mass fraud during the Georgian election. And this is a good chance for us here in Moscow, in our debates over the fate of Georgian democracy, to say that probably this is a sign of newly emerging maturity of Georgian democratic system, despite all the pitfalls and shortcomings. The second point, of course, is that obviously Georgian elections were watched very carefully in Moscow, because Georgia is not just another ex-Soviet republic. You know that after the August 2008 war, which led to Moscow recognition of breakaway republics of Abkhazia and Northern Ossetia, President Saakashvili was considered to be a personal foe of President Putin and all Russian people, or vast majority of them. That is why, of course, while Russian political elite and Russian leadership, as well as Russian society, were just watching carefully where Georgia is heading and what would be the result of this election. And the common understanding here is that really this is something more than just an ordinary election. This is a threshold election, sort of a Rubicon, which can just, come as a dramatic turnaround in the development of Georgia. And the big question, of course, what would be with Russian-Georgian elections after that?
In the sense that this is a turnaround that would presumably be good for the Russian government, although they might not say that in public, in the halls of power in the Kremlin. They've got to be glad about this, haven't they?
Well, that's a very good question. In fact, let me say that Russian officials, high-ranking officials, are tight-lipped over the elections. And I understand that because really the result is actually a double-edged sword in a sense that on one hand, it seems that Moscow's arch-rival, President Saakashvili, was humiliated. He tried to emerge as a leader of the nation, and today we discovered that the majority of Georgians doesn't want him and his party anymore. So this is the good news for Moscow and for Kremlin. But on the other hand, the big question mark is whether the new Georgian authorities, the new Georgian government, would be more friendly, more cooperative with Moscow. And here we have still doubts over that. And the reason is that it seems that Moscow is no more lucrative. It doesn't seem as a fascinating model for Georgian political elite, as for Georgian political power, public, despite of what they think over their domestic politics. Yes, Georgians may quarrel. They can lock horns over their domestic issues, over the development strategy, over the fate of Georgian economy, over the social programs. But it seems that they're unanimous that Russia's move to recognize Abkhazia and Northern Ossetia was a move in the wrong direction. And they want to get the control of the breakaway territories. That's why I don't see, well, in what way the new Georgian authorities would be able just to make a drastic change in the relations in Russia. Probably their tone will be more subtle, but that's all.
James Nixie, does this represent a drastic change in Georgia's political landscape for you, and does it surprise you?
Yes, for Georgia itself, this is absolutely extraordinary. And we said it was extraordinary back in 2003, of course, after the Rose Revolution. But the Rose Revolution was different insofar as there was a fraudulent election which led to the revolution and led to the most radically transformative post-Soviet government we've seen and the most incredibly un-Soviet president we've ever seen in Mikhail Saakashvili. Things gradually deteriorated from then on in. But the fact of the matter is, here we're seeing, for the very first time really in Caucasus history, we're seeing a situation where there is a transfer of power from incumbent to opposition purely through the ballot box. At least that's how it seems as things stand. So in that sense, this is remarkable for Georgian maturity, if you like, as a 21, 22-year-old country. But for Georgians themselves, of course, they won't feel a difference in their lives immediately. But you may find that there are increased trade links with Russia, and that will begin to feed through and to trickle down into Georgians' daily lives, and that the immediate, not the long term, but the immediate economic benefits of a slightly better relationship with Russia, presumably, will, for the most part, just help the lives of the average Georgian person. Now, it's a difficult thing to predict at the moment. But it's on that basis, at least it's partly on that basis, that Georgian Dream and Bidzina Ivanishvili have done so well. Of course, for a number of reasons: disillusionment, corruption, the recent prison abuse scandal video. There are a whole number of reasons. But the promise of better economic times is not to be discounted.
Mm-hmm. Fair point, and we'll talk about Mr. Saakashvili's record in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But let's just take a step back now and take a look at Georgia's recent history and how we got here. Back in 1991, Georgians voted overwhelmingly for independence in a referendum. Georgia left the Soviet Union and Zviad Gamzahurdia was elected president. 1 year later, fighting broke out between government and opposition forces. Gamzahurdia was deposed and Edward Shevardnadze took power. Flash forward to 2003, and there were allegations of irregularities in parliamentary elections. Georgians forced out Shevardnadze in what became known as the Rose Revolution. A state of emergency was declared in 2007 after riot police battled protesters demanding the president's resignation. Rights groups warned of what they described as growing authoritarianism. And then in 2008, tensions between Georgia and Russia escalated into a full-blown war in South Ossetia. At least 30,000 people were displaced by the fighting after Russian forces invaded the disputed territory. The two sides eventually signed a French-brokered peace agreement. Now, James Nixie, if I could turn back to you on this. If we try to understand if we look at the record, which you alluded to earlier, of Mr. Saakashvili and the accusations of abuse of power and so on, in that respect, it shouldn't surprise us then that we've come to this result.
No, the fact of the matter is that Saakashvili fell into the same trap as his predecessor, who you mentioned earlier, Edvard Shevardnadze, the former Soviet foreign minister in the Kremlin in Soviet times. The fact of the matter is he stayed in power for just under 10 years, as was Edvard Shevardnadze before him, and there was a slow initial respect, initial awe, if you like, both for Shevardnadze, who was thought to be a very clever and a very good foreign minister for the Soviet Union. And again, Mr. Saakashvili, he came to power at the age of 36. In Georgia, he was Western educated. He was a New York lawyer. He'd been in Brussels, and he was really felt as a real breath of fresh air. We'd never seen anything like him, as I was saying, and so the gradual decline in human rights issues, but really in the system itself, and the corruption at the elite level. Saakashvili did an incredible thing in Georgia in the early part of his reign. He really did root out corruption at the lower levels, at the police force, in the security services, in government positions. But unfortunately, over time, that corruption filtered upwards into the uppermost levels of the Georgian government, and that began to be noticed not only by Georgian politicians themselves, of course, but also by the people, and that message got out, and it particularly got out under a unified opposition, which is what we see with Georgian Dream now.
Eka Gagauri, if I could turn back to you on this, given that Mr. Saakashvili is going to remain as president over the next 12 months, he's now going to have to work with the man who has just beaten him in these parliamentary elections. What is that going to mean for Georgia?
At this point, it's very difficult to predict anything. So I think that one thing will happen is that the parliament will become stronger. So, and the president today, we might say he acknowledged that the Georgian Dream Coalition won this election. So, and really the coalition has the possibility to get the majority in the parliament. So, and I think that after that they should, both parties actually should sit and discuss the composition of the government. This will be very important. And also that so how to act in the future. So I mentioned that it is very important to have the strong parliament in this country, because during all these years, the last years, when there was one ruling party with the constitutional majority, we observed that the parliament became very weak. So whatever was initiated by the executive branch was adopted by the parliament. We did not see the discussions between different parties there. We did not saw the different opinions in the parliament, and the parliament was very weak to supervise the executive branch, and that was a very big problem. Another problem that we had because of the weak parliament was related to the judiciary, which was also the trust towards judiciary is very low in Georgia. So I think that the one thing which is positive and we can predict in this at this moment is that we will have stronger parliament, which will be able to supervise the executive branch and really do a lot in regards of judiciary, the improvement of judiciary in this country.
All right, I want to talk now about something that may have turned the tide in this election campaign. About a week and a half ago, about a week and a half before the elections, a video surfaced that showed Georgian prisoners being abused. It shows guards sodomizing prisoners with a broom handle and a truncheon, and it outraged Georgians. The government responded by condemning the attack and swiftly fired top officials. But some say the video may have changed the outcome of Monday's parliamentary elections. Both critics and supporters of President Saakashvili acknowledge he's brought down the crime rate, but for many, this shows there's been a trade-off: the rise of increasingly abusive security forces. Sergei Strokhin, if I could turn back to you on this. First of all, do you think that the news of this video is what turned the tide in these elections?
Obviously, it could have played a role. We were watching the developments carefully here, and We've seen the mass protests which broke out not only in Tbilisi but in other major Georgian cities once this video was unveiled. Well, some say that it was masterminded by President Saakashvili's force, who just were shooting that deliberately and then leaked it to the media. But regardless of how it was done, whether it was a smart PR exercise against Saakashvili or that was really a genuine act, obviously it told on the sentiment, on the general sentiments. But at the same time, well, this is a more deep-seated problem, and we should not reduce it only to that episode of that scandalous video. There's a growing understanding here in Moscow that people were tired over Saakashvili. We have a lot of friends there, we used to call them, and they are saying that, well, really Misha, how they call them, he's everywhere. Some say he's like your Putin, you know. So probably there was a growing irritation in Georgia over that. And in addition to that, while trying to cement the Georgian state after the dark age of Eduard Shevardnadze, who was nicknamed Grey Fox, President Saakashvili probably really jeopardized basic democratic freedoms in the country. And in Georgian society, which is not used to that type of things, we could have expected such results. That's why I'm actually not surprised of the results.
James Nixon, what did this video represent to you? Is it part of a larger problem of alleged abuse by security forces in Georgia?
The fact of the matter is that the reason I believe that this video was politically timed to come out at that moment is because it was generally well known that such abuses happened in Georgian prisons. It was known amongst the population, it was known therefore by politicians as well. So it's not much use the politicians saying that they are shocked by it. They're shocked by the images because the images themselves are very graphic. But I think that when you think about the fact that there are 5 times as many prisoners in Georgian prisons than there were when Mikhail Saakashvili came to power in 2003, 5 times more now, then it shows that, yes, Georgia's made considerable inroads into crime prevention, but as Sergei Strokhan, I think, just said, that does show in a way it's forced a problem inside. That may be better than it being outside, but it shows that though there are social issues which have simply not been addressed in contemporary Georgia. So they've made progress in some issues, but often squeezed the problems into other areas, much as has happened in.
All right, let's get to Eka Gagauri's view on that. Is there a lot of room for improvement as far as social issues in Georgia?
Yes, indeed. So I would say that really this is one of the problematic issues that we have in Georgia, especially in the regions. So people, the standard of life is not really very high. And the unemployment rate is very high as well. So that is why the opposition parties and also the government focused during their pre-election campaign on employment, on development of infrastructure, on healthcare issues, because these are really the issues about which the population cares.
All right. That is going to have to be the last word. We've got to leave it there. I want to thank all 3 of our guests from Tbilisi, Eka Gagauri, from Moscow, Sergei Strokhan, and from London, James Nixie. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, if you want to send us your feedback, you can email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Hazem Sika. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.